you for being here. And I think people could also simply come up and get the mic if they want to, if they have questions or comments or reflections of their own. I don't think this needs to be a Q&A as much as
conversation.
as a conversation, us thinking together.
Thank you.
Whoops.
Hi, my name is Eric. I use pronouns like they, them, and their. And I missed the beginning half because I was in my desert discipleship class. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating something. This last Earth Day on Friday, I used my student job as a coordinator of Life Together to arrange some events that kind of were meant to get the community to start coming back together and to just create some awareness around some of the things that I'm not terribly happy about that are happening at our institution in terms of being ecological. And it was really fun. It was really great. But one of the hardest pieces about it was we're still coming out of this pandemic time. It feels like this was such a missed opportunity. And as our speaker said yesterday, it's completely understandable. We were all in the inner rings of trauma, and there's no way that we could have created substantial change. We just had to bear through the storm for a little while. But it does feel like we've created a level of awareness and that we've had kind of a reprieve for many people, especially people who have wealth and the ability to stay at home and hunker down for 2 months. I just wonder, where do you see the passion towards ecological work going, and how can we start to integrate that into conversations, not necessarily on a moral playing field, because morals is part of what has made us so tired, because the earth is burning and the diseases are spreading and everything. So how do we engage this conversation in a meaningful, impactful way? And I'll leave it there.
Fast questions. It might feel as if the pandemic has given us a reprieve, but it hasn't really. First of all, the pandemic is due in large part to what humans have been doing and how they have been eating and how they have been robbing livestock of places to live without interfering in human lives or transmitting viruses and all that. I think that narrative hasn't been told enough or hasn't risen to consciousness. Second, I think early in the pandemic, it seemed as if there was a reprieve from the ecological devastation. People were flying somewhat less, and so on and so forth. But the numbers, I don't think, bear that out substantially. And thirdly, while many human beings, especially in the first world, and the news media relentlessly pursued pandemic numbers and issues, the numbers and issues of ecological devastation went alongside it all, but weren't remarked on. So my sense isn't so much that anything has changed in terms of the ecological emergency we are living with, except that we've had another point in time when we haven't made that the focus of ongoing life on earth. Now, if you asked me how that can be changed, that's a larger conversation, but in relation to the pandemic, that's where I would come down. And there are powerful forces that will keep focus on whatever the emergency of the day is, away from fundamental changes in lifestyle, economics, politics, that would need to happen to attend to the ecological devastation in earnest. So yeah, this isn't the Paschal homily of St. John Chrysostom.
I'd like to dovetail on that particular question. Where I come from, I rural roots, small town, 125 down in southern Missouri, eking little farms, eked out a living on 120 acres. And so life has changed because my brother-in-law has a seed corn company, and he'll put under tillage this year 6,000 acres of land. Most of that is owned by other farmers who are putting the seed into the ground for him. But I watch the way that industry has continued to grow, and I know the worldwide effects how food on some tables. But the way that we are doing farming, it just continues to wipe out whatever little trees were left. It continues to get worse usage of the soil that could produce something and save some livestock or some animals and kind of thing. What do you see? And I do not have privy to conversations with how ecologists are saying, how can we confront on a massive scale worldwide? Because it's not just our country, it's the whole planet that's under devastation.
Yeah.
So I just want you to unload what you see practically can happen before we have another flood.
I need as much help as you do, even getting a handle on understanding the forces that shape our food consumption, practices of eating, planting, and all that. And I certainly don't have any answers. A colleague of mine, a Roman Catholic sister, last year published a book on global food production and Eucharistic eating. And it was a total eye-opener for me. Mary McGann is her name. I think it was published with Liturgical Press. But it was an eye-opener in terms of how my own practices of daily eating, which I try to do honoring the land and producing some of my own food and not buying things wrapped in plastic as much as I can, and so on and so forth, how there are much larger forces that shape, not my choice at the grocery store, but what gets planted. And one of the most startling insights for me was, you need to read the book, because there is a lot of, she has done all that background work on food production and consumption and has ideas on what changes would need to take place, but also how we need to change our practices of the Eucharist. Because, as she pointed out, in the Catholic Church, at least, I don't know how it is with you, but in the US, 80% of Eucharistic hosts are now produced by a big agro-business company that hides itself behind some sort of homey, oh, we have made Eucharistic hosts on our land for 100 years kind of thing, but they've been bought up. Behind them is mass-produced Eucharistic hosts. It would have never occurred to me that to think that the Eucharist I receive every Sunday is part of, and this company that owns this production behind the scenes is, has been cited for labor violations and what have you. So, gosh, we have so much work to do. Yeah. Which is why I keep thinking, that what I know and what I can confront, I do, but I cannot do it all that is necessary. And I have to find my sanity in the calling, what Jewish brothers and sisters would call tikkun olam, healing, the calling to heal where we can, to heal the earth where we can. But I've also learned that it's larger, that there is a whole, how shall I say? There are forces that have shaped us little people to say, oh, let's recycle and let's buy organic and let's do this, that, and the other. And what's behind that drive to make that so important is an oil industry that wants to shield its practices from sustained change. So it really startled me to learn that my sort of, yes, let's, I start with myself and I'm going to get this right, is part of a whole cultural production that veils the larger forces that shape this. So, yeah, Dorothy. Oh.
And yet I know you persist in trying to live as if your actions made a difference. And we often, I think one of the best lines for me in your talk, and I've heard you talk many times about this, but was, we Americans, we want to be pragmatic, we want to fix it. And yeah, and you bring this up at Christ Lutheran. We use cloth grocery bags, right? We're washing our coffee cups now. And this is, so, yeah, and as you said, the, what is it? Exxon created the whole idea of the personal climate footprint, carbon footprint, as a way of shifting responsibility on me when they've got the whole infrastructure all locked up. So I want to ask, but to disdain people's efforts, no, we want to recruit. There's a deep longing in those cloth grocery bags, right? Sure. In those there's a longing there. And you can look at it and say, this will do nothing to save the earth. And yet want to recruit that longing. So do you have any, how do we transform that? I mean, how do we recruit that longing into a movement that will hold oil companies and presidents and all those people accountable?
I have always been a firm believer in environmentally attentive, let's say green living, stretching the gamut from the dandelions I harvest in my garden as wild edibles to whom I vote for in a US presidential election. And it's not either or you choose. It's gotta be the gamut. And that's hard labor. I transitioned last year to an electric vehicle. I thought I'll have a nervous breakdown with, setting all that up. It's not that easy. It sounds great, but wow. So have I answered your question? Basically, I come back to, I support every little bit of greening initiative around me. If one neighbor joins me in No Mow May and letting the grass grow wild for pollinators in May and not cutting their grass, hey, that's victory. If I can help take care of a president, I mean, in the sense of booting him out, who was a disaster for environmental anything, never mind other things, I'm going to be a part of it. If I can, I haven't worked up the courage or the energy or even the how do I do this yet to have my priest in my parish think about where our Eucharistic hosts come from. I hate to think what the answer would be when I start digging, but do you have better ideas, or not better, but other ideas?
The Lutheran Chautauqua happens at Lakeside Retreat Center every year, and they always offer, every year they have some ecological workshops. And so I went to one of them. It was on microgreens. And there was afterwards, there was an OSU student there, and she was, interested in this. And I started telling her about my interest in ecology as a youth. And she was giving me the funniest looks. And I said, well, you understand the need. And she said, yeah, but I didn't think you would. She was sure because of maybe the color of my hair, that I would not be interested. And I said, oh yes, I said, I was the only child who ran home to see if organic gardening was in my mailbox or not. And she laughed also, and she was very encouraged by that. So I think that something we can do is make ourselves known to youth who might think that we never heard of conservation. Those are old-fashioned terms: conservation, ecology. Those are old. But I'm working with Bill McKibben, and he has gathered youth, and so I communicate with them. And I don't have a hub in my village yet, but I attend some things online, and I'm learning, and hopefully, we can get something going locally. Are you familiar with Bill McKibben?
Sure.
Is it? Okay, well, I think I'll pursue that. And there's a pastor that I respect so much in our conference, and he's so ecological that he rides his bike everywhere. Okay? And he and his wife. I've never seen them in a car. And when I talked to him about this youth organization, he said to me, what can we offer them? Referring to his age. He's about 15 years older than we are. And I said, oh, what we have is stability, strength, and encouragement, that we can offer that to youth, because we've been through more hard times just because of our age. We've been through, we have trusted God and seen God come through for us, so many times. And that's something that the youth, just because of their age, have not had as much experience with. So I think that we can be extremely useful as we, when asked, okay, not to power over anyone, but if invited, we can be very encouraging. So I'm glad to see you acknowledge Bill McKibben. That's
one aside. We, like you, have transitioned to one electric vehicle in our family. My wife, we have a Chevy Bolt. And there is a learning curve because you have to be able to, you have to plan your trip out based
Yeah.
on where charging stations are.
Yeah.
But charging stations are popping up all over the
Yes.
place, and it's getting easier to find electricity. But
Yeah.
you know, the debate this week was, do we live over between Toledo and Sandusky, Ohio, and our Bolt in cold weather has about a 200-mile range. And I thought we should maybe bring my Equinox that, you know, instead of the Volt, but Beth convinced me that, you know, we should bring the Volt. And, you know, we stopped in South Bend. There's a mall that has several charging stations there. And we just stopped there, and, you know, in like 55 minutes, we had a full charge. And we have enough to get back there, and then we'll charge up and head back home. You know, it's the way home. But it takes it. You have to. When I read things online about people who are just talking bad about electric vehicles, it's like they're not looking at it realistically. They're looking at it that their gas cars are so much better. And they talk about, you know, how much other things goes into the battery and things like that are mined from the earth. And yes, true.
Yeah.
But they ignore the fact that oil comes out of the ground, that those cars are made out of iron. I mean, you know, steel, iron, aluminum. I mean, just like any other car, and that their gas products continue to pollute our air, whether it's the cars they're driving or the refineries that produce it.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about what you said earlier about laments needing to be truthful, and about the reality that many of these systemic issues are beyond our individual control. That being said, our individual actions do matter. I'm thinking especially about what you said about electric vehicles and organic food, and how that means nothing for the community that I come from, because my home congregation is made up of working poor who can barely afford the used vehicle they have. And when I think about preaching this message from a pastoral standpoint, I want to balance the truth that our actions can do very little for the big picture, but that they still matter. And on one hand, I feel like that's nihilism. If I tell these people to buy a Prius, they're either going to roll their eyes at me, or they're going to internalize that and feel shame.
Yeah.
How do we make this message matter and be good news for the poor? Because if it's not good news for them, I don't think it's good news for any of us.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Several things come to my mind. You reminded me of a Brazilian liberation bishop in the 1980s, who 70s, who decided not to. This was a Catholic bishop. He decided not to tell his people anything about fasting for Lent because they never had enough food anyway. And he said, this kind of preaching is disrespectful. It might be the liturgical tradition, but I'm not gonna tell people who don't have enough food about fasting. So I'm with you. I'm very aware, and I mean, have experienced that, of the eliteness of many green movements, people, attempts, struggles. So And I know that people in marginalized communities here and around the globe are not the main culprits in ecological devastation. It's upper middle class white US people who are historically the greatest polluters of the planet. That's just, it's not Africans and Latin Americans, it's the lament has to be over practices of a particular group. I think you are the best, or certainly a better judge than I am about preaching and living the good news in your community. And I doubt it has anything to do with buying electric vehicles or buying organic. But it might have to do something with, I don't know, talking about environmental racism.
I wonder too, this raises another question for me. That's true, that's so true, that it's the practices of a small group that cause this. I wonder too, though, as our middle class shrinks, as economic oppression becomes a more broad issue, how much the language of marginalization is useful here, when I think increasingly it's the average person who cannot afford these things.
I should have said historically marginalized.
Yeah.
We are seeing new patterns of marginalization, and yeah, granted. Sorry, I can't offer any snazzy insights beyond saying, yes, you are right in your analysis. Go and without killing yourself, try and offer us something better.
I think about the things we do already. We already make our own communion bread. I don't think we're thinking about that ecologically, though.
That's a small step. To read Mary McGann's book about sort of global food systems. And it's on your syllabus. Mary McGann, McGann.
And there's someone typing into the chat box, and I am too excited to read that small.
Me too. I certainly cannot read it. Can one of you read it, or? Ah.
Yeah, and so that's the.
I'm not sure. I think they are typing a question into the chat now. Yes. The meal that reconnects Eucharistic eating and the global food crisis.
Hello?
All right. Scott can ask his question now.
Give it a second.
Can you hear me?
Scott, we think you can ask your question.
Only if you can hear me.
Barely, speak up a little.
Barely speak up a little. Okay, I will yell. Nope, can't hear me. Okay. Well, this isn't going to work.
I think the microphone needs help, so hang on a second.
Try again, Scott.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Pay no
Uh,
attention.
First of all, thank you so much for your address, which said so much that needs to be said. I want to affirm what the last questioner asked and remind myself that ever since Cain and Abel, our fratricide and our ecocide have been connected. The ground cries out with Abel's blood. And of course, after fratricide and ecocide comes suicide. So we are all perpetrators and ultimately victims in what we have done, no matter who is responsible for what. I also wanted to note a couple of things that let's see, Revelation 5:13, I think, was one of the texts you illustrated to show all creation praising God. That shows up in the lectionary this coming Sunday, actually. And it's a reminder to me that whether we're talking about Revelation 5 or whether we're talking about the angels in Luke 2, the Gloria, the creation, is not just praising God for its existence. That's not the only reason the creation praises the Creator. And specifically, the incarnation is not complete when the child is born in Bethlehem, because that child goes on to take on not just the elemental iron in our blood and the gut microbes that we have, but also takes on the form of dead flesh, takes on the form of being defunct and extinct. And so in the midst of the death that we have caused and the death that we are dying with, we also have this stubborn promise that Scripture won't let us not see. This promise from one who takes on even death and yet lives. The gospel that is paired with that Revelation text this Sunday is, of course, from John 21, Peter being restored to our Lord's good graces on the lakeside there. If we believe Matthew 10, where Jesus says, you know, if you deny me before people, I will deny you to my Father, then we know that Peter is not only under a material death sentence, but an eschatological death sentence. And yet Jesus has overcome death, overcome entropy, overcome time, overcome even his own words to restore Peter and to set Peter out to do good, to feed my sheep, to live again in anticipation of that promise that even he who was condemned can live. And it seems to me that will always be something that no matter how much death we have caused, no matter how much death Christians have caused in this world, that promise of the one who went down to the dust where no one praises God and yet now lives again to praise God is a hope that we can share with each other and with the world community, which God knows is on the same page as us in terms of the crisis that we face. At least the world religious community, I would hope. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very robust explication of Christian hope. I like it. Okay, is there still? No, it's fixed. Thank you. Ben, I think you had a question or comment, reflection.
Test, yes. So, kind of, I'm circling back to your talk, Teresa, which was so stimulating and interesting to me, and including, I thought you excavated some of the liturgical themes of Laudato Si that I wish had been more evident on the surface of the text. And so I'm really eager to go back and trace some of that language. The communion, I missed that, I think. And so thank you for that. And then I like one of the distillations of your talk that's sticking with me is that I think the liturgical we, first person plural, I think you're saying it sometimes it's too narrow. It's understood to be just humans. And then this conversation that we're having now makes me also wonder if you're also saying it's too broad when it comes to responsibility. That when we think of some of the composed liturgical confessions of ecological sin that talk about we simply as the human species, right? And I think that's part of, if we're goading the people of Flint, Michigan to say, confess your ecological sins, or the Pine Ridge Reservation, confess your sins. That's a problem on a number of levels. And so I'm wondering, do you have thoughts about, can the liturgy help us is it the liturgy's job, or should we do that somewhere else in church life to get a better sense of where ecological confession of sin happens, because it was cooked up in Exxon's boardroom to get the ecological footprint that says, well, it's our job just simply to change this around by being better consumers. At the same time, I do also want to say my ancestors lived through the Depression on organic food from their gardens, and it was better for them. And it is true, EVs cost less than gas burners over the use of those vehicles. So we're getting sold a little. Exxon is still on this, and I'll say I got one too. I got a used Bolt, and it's made me, I'm glad to say, more politically impatient with our systems that keep us locked in a fossil fuel economy. It's not an accident. But to me, again, it's that question of I love the broad we for who are the creatures that worship. It's the whole cosmos. But then in terms of liturgical identification of culpability, is the liturgy the right place to do it? Is there some other place that we do a systemic analysis of what I think is more like the 0.1% who are actually responsible, the people who are picking up the garbage? And most of us don't really have much agency at all in this crisis. Most people would like to have universal health care and deal with climate change, but we're blocked by a very, very small minority.
So I have several things going through my head again, and none of them is a quick fix or an answer, really. The first one, what you said about the we that laments or confesses, reminded me of when I first came to the US in the mid-1980s, when people, this was at a divinity school in the South, when they wanted to invoke, ultimate evil, they would start talking about the Nazis. And something rubbed me wrong, and it wasn't that I'm feeling German nationalism. That wasn't my generation. But I kept saying, when I say that, I confess the sinfulness of my people. When in the southern US, they can only invoke the Nazis as ultimate evil, I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? There is some evil right down your doorsteps that you could invoke as ultimate evil. So there is power in shrinking and particularizing what you think of and lament as evil to make it point to you. That's the first thing. The second thing has to do with liturgy. And I hope I'm not treading on anybody's toes here. If so, mea culpa. I seriously wonder whether making congregations sing about melting icebergs is a way to go. I mean, I hope the hymn writer isn't in this little group. Okay. There are a couple of hymns in the All Creation Sings that are laments for what human beings have done. And so the congregation sings about melting icebergs. It reminds me of in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, with the new cosmology gaining ground, suddenly we had lots of Eucharistic prayers that included galaxies in the praise of God, or stars or swirling galaxies, or is that the way to go, that we insert catchwords into our liturgies? I'm not sure. I'm simply asking. Yeah, and the third thing, totally unrelated, that swirled through my head was I read and assume it is true because of the source I read it in, that Ukraine actually has the largest fields of lithium. It used to be the Andes, and the poor Andean peasants all suffer because we drained their water, underground water, to get lithium out for our snazzy electric vehicles. Ukraine apparently has the largest known lithium reservoirs on the planet, which is a key ingredient for electric vehicles. And I sometimes ask myself, is there a reason? I mean, there are other reasons why this is fought over so intensely. And I don't question those reasons, but what are economic reasons? Just like Iraq, it wasn't fought over because it had massive amounts of broccoli. It doesn't, but I'm just making that up. But anyway, so 3 totally unconnected reflections. Your questions are good and my answers are lame. but it's the best I can do. So, yeah. I'm older than you are, and so have seen especially hymns, but also liturgies emerge that take up the banners of the day, okay? And for me, a crucial moment was when the men sort of dropped out of hymnody and liturgical texts, and it was men and women. And in my community in the Catholic Church, we fought hard over having sisters added to brothers in certain places, even where it's not biblical. When we now proclaim a reading, it's sisters and brothers. When Paul clearly says brothers, okay? So fast forward 30 or 40 years, and this binary, normative binary, is dismantled. But we now have all these hymns that celebrated that, and you go, oh, Lord, do I need to sing about sisters and brothers again, or men and women? And so the danger I see is that it buys into a hot terminology of the day and doesn't last. But I guess that's the danger in any theology that is in conversation with contemporary developments. I'm not sure we can get out of that. So, yeah.
My Lutheran struggle, maybe it's not Lutheran, it's maybe everybody struggles with the flood and that narrative of where was it, how did it happen, God cleans up the mess.
Well, God cleaned up the mess.
I don't know.
then.
I don't know. What do we do with stories like that? How does that affect theology that's living today? That's going a different direction than what you've talked about.
I see where, yeah. I don't know. I would have to think about that more. It has occurred to me recently that this may be a good time to reread all the apocalyptic materials we have in the scriptures and try and reread it in light of our own times, not the kind of nice eschatology we have sitting out there somewhere, but real apocalyptic texts. Okay. I still need to do that. Go back in earnest to those scriptures. What appeals to me is that they are written for a time of devastating, for crisis. And that in the midst of crisis, there is always, I think our speaker yesterday morning brought that up, at least as a tangent. In a crisis, there is always something that breaks apart everything that was there. But that can be liberating, that suddenly what you thought was written in stone is shattered. It's one of the things that I think COVID did. It shattered some certainties. And for those of us who are older and have had certainties shattered before, I kept thinking about my mother living through 2 world wars. I would have loved to talk to her. You know, you had your life totally shattered at least twice. Those are resilient people. And it doesn't surprise me that young people, particularly of a particular socioeconomic background, struggled the hardest with COVID. I'm not blaming them.
The story of the flood was important to me in my Old Testament class in seminary. And what I took comfort in that God said that there would be a covenant between God and creation. It wasn't between God and mankind. It was between God and creation, that there would never be another violence by flooding the whole earth. And, you know, the covenant means that God's going to keep that side of the bargain. And we, our creation, you know how we talk about some species are invasive species? You know, and I wonder, wow, are we causing, you know, some plant species to be violent, you know, toward others and knocking out the species? But you know, all of creation is in on this together. And I think that what God was looking for is for us to turn to God
And to me, the plants and animals are leading the way in that, every time a bird takes a drink of water, they nod to God and thanks. So I feel like all of this creation is leading the way. And if we pay attention to creation, walk with creation, that I can trust God for this covenant. That's my hope.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that God made covenants not only with human beings, but with everything created. That's long been forgotten in how we have read the scriptures. If you find comfort in that, meaning that planet Earth will not be destroyed or become uninhabitable, I will be the last person to argue against that. I'm not so sure that we can claim that as assurance, or that it would be helpful to foreground that as assurance in the here and now. But,
I agree that it shouldn't, that now's not the time to be offering blanket assurance at all. But for Beth, that I feel God is saying, you've turned to me and you keep trying your hardest to turn to me. And the people around you seem to turn to me more when they're with you. And certainly your animals and the animals around you are leading the way. So I guess it's how I live day to day.
Yeah. More power to you.
Years ago, I did a retreat for teenagers called Creator of the Stars and Night. And it sent me on this journey of how big is the universe, which if I pulled out the text right now is irrelevant because we're now pretty sure we have multiple universes. So my text from even 10 or 15 years ago isn't big enough. And the whole point of it for me that I still wrestle with in really profound ways from that. I don't know if anybody else that day got this, but was just how small our image of God is. And what stood out to me today was the last picture you showed with "You Are Here." That's not a picture of Earth. That little dot's our sun. And if it disappears, when it disappears, because we actually do know that someday our sun runs out of its own energy and it won't be us using cars to do it, we won't exist as Earth. And God still will. And I think that's where our preaching needs to start, is that God is always going to be there, and whether we live or not really isn't theologically necessary. And so,
Who's the we?
well, you and
Human
I,
beings? Okay.
or Earth is itself,
Okay.
the creation itself goes on in the universe, it's not centered to this little itty bitty planet in the middle of this vast, what might be multiple universes. And that promise of Noah is that God won't destroy again by flood. God doesn't say you won't do it.
Yeah.
And so we're hastening on something that is actually inevitable at some level. And yet there is sin in that, because it should be God's to play that out, not ours. But I think until we can preach that God will exist when we don't, and we can mean that, I don't think we have a way to start this conversation, because until we can really believe that we cannot exist as an entire species, and in taking ourselves down, take our planet with us as the ultimate, anytime we give back the gift of life to God and murder life in any form intentionally, we have stepped into grave sin. But I think we need to start with the idea that we cannot exist and God will still exist. Because someplace, if we don't believe that, then God's always going to have to rescue us, because we're the thing that we're making God. and God hasn't made us. And until we get really clear about who's the creator and who's the created over and over again, we're never going to bow enough and be humbled enough to realize the destruction that we're causing. Even in the midst of what we don't understand, because there's so much that even as we try to fix things, we create other problems. And so where's the grace in that as we just keep stepping into it? But if we can't do it, God will still exist.
I know we have to come to a close, but maybe a good way to close it in response to you is to suggest that we think of different horizons of hope. And there might be the smallest horizon of, I hope to go and get some lunch soon, to the largest horizon, ultimately the creator God, uncreated, will be there. And my life in the ultimate hope is we'll find life beyond planet Earth in God's own life. But there are a million other horizons of hope between those two things. I would love my child's life to flourish and my grandchild's life. And I would love to see Lake Whitney be cleaned up and flourish and be sustainable, and so on and so forth. So where you fall in these different horizons of hope, to some degree depends on the time of day. I want my lunch now. But you cannot ever, or you should not ever exist without the largest horizon in place and you living towards that. I think I just went into preaching mode, which is very unusual for a Catholic woman, that is. So, good. I did. Not intentionally, but I mean, yeah.
Well, thank you all for raising so many questions that are difficult to answer. But yes, thank you all for caring as much as you do and thinking deeply about this existential crisis that we're living in.